Good. Yes. Well, look, assuming there are people out there, hello, and thank you for joining us to the extent that you have. Coming all the way to your own desks is very, very good of you. My name is Hugo Rifkind. If you told me last year I'd be speaking at the Conservative Party conference, it would be happening in an attic in Crouch End with a dartboard on the wall, I probably would have thought you'd lost your mind, and yet here we are. And so apologies to anybody who has. We're here today to basically to talk about how to legislate against online harms. Implicit in what we're discussing, I suppose, in the title, is that we should be legislating against online harms, which I hope is something that we will talk about generally. What we mean by online harms, really, what are we talking about? We're talking about hate speech, racism, things like that. We're also talking about libel. We're talking about fake news, both organic and kind of state-sponsored. We're talking about those kind of big things. We're also talking about what might feel like smaller, more personal things, cyberbullying, difficulties with body image that arise from online, from social media, which are online harms, a growth in eating disorders, the degradation of kind of civic discourse generally. Are we all getting nastier and madder, leading to Twitter pylons, whether we're becoming fighty and offensive and just plain nasty, whether we're not sleeping enough? As a journalist, I've covered online harms and how we ought to legislate against them and deal with them extensively. And I find myself sort of occupying a nuanced and perhaps unsatisfactory position. On the one hand, I've always believed that social media companies they are neglecting their duty of care towards users, and they're doing so deliberately for commercial purposes. There's this sort of now old internet saying that if you aren't the customer, you're the product. But it's actually worse than that. Shoshana Zuboff, in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, makes a decent case that rather than even being the product, we're in fact the kind of coalface from which the product is mined, which is even worse. These companies do, I believe, need to be reined in. However, I didn't spend however long it was fighting against what I believe to be a repressive state regulation of newspapers, only to end up with even more repressive state regulation of literally everything said on the internet. It's a conundrum I have not yet solved. And whenever a solution is posed towards solving it, I do find myself generally being against it. So I have quite a lot to learn. But look, I shan't go on for too much longer because you didn't come here just to listen to me. You didn't come anywhere, but wherever you did come, you didn't come just to listen to me. First, let me introduce our panel in no particular order other than being the order I have written in front of me. Hello, Baroness Morgan. Baroness Morgan, as Nicky Morgan, was elected as Conservative MP for Loughborough in 2010. In 2012, she was Assistant Government Chief Whip. In 2014, she became the Secretary of State for Education. In 2019, she was Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which I suppose is the most relevant posting here. And she was raised to the peerage as Baroness Morgan of Cotes in the county of Leicestershire in 2020. Lord Eric Pickles was first elected to Parliament in 1992. He retired as the MP for Brentwood and Ongar at the 2017 general election. He was previously Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government and has held many front bench posts, including Shadow Minister for Transport, Minister for Faith, and the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. He became Baron Pickles of Brentwood and Ongar in the county of Essex in 2018. Rosie Mulhern, hello Rosie, is 19 years old and from Reading, but she is studying history at the University of Durham. She took part in the Holocaust Educational Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz project in 2018, becoming an ambassador for the Trust. And following this, she applied for and was accepted to the Trust Regional Ambassador Programme, which is a 3-year extended leadership programme. She started that last year. Danny Stone has led the professional team at the Antisemitism Policy Trust for a decade, during which time it has helped to deliver a number of cross-party initiatives recognised by governments and civil society organisations in Britain and overseas as crucial to the fight against anti-Semitism. And of course, Karen Pollock is the Chief Executive of the Holocaust Educational Trust. I think that is everybody. I'm now going to hand over to Danny, who will give us a short introduction to proceedings before we go back to the panel. Danny, all yours.
Thank you so much, Hugo, and thank you for chairing and introducing.
Pleasure.
Thank you to everybody who's joined tonight. Thank you to the co-panelists. I suppose I just wanted to give a brief introduction, some headlines about where we are with online harms. And it's important to say we are somewhere. There has been a green paper and a white paper in advance of what we expect to be an online harms bill that we hope to see soon. There's been an interim response to the initial white paper, and we're hoping for that full response. I just wanted to cover a couple of points, which is that, you know, I looked online again today, I did last week, and found illegal content within about 5 minutes. And it's not a big surprise because according to the European Commission, only 42% of reported illegal content on the platforms it monitors was removed in the UK. That's up from 20% in the first round and a high of 60%. But by April this year, 53 5G masts have been burned down. One Vodafone mast was serving the Birmingham Nightingale Hospital. And although COVID conspiracies have been covered up on platforms like Facebook and removed on Twitter, they still ran rampant on Telegram and offline, obviously. The actions offline are illegal, but the conspiracy content isn't. Going back to July, Richard Kiley Cowie posted an average of one tweet every 87 seconds for 12 hours until his account was locked. And you may have heard about Richard as Wiley. He gained masses of Twitter followers. He had 306 million impressions across 860 minutes. That's 356,000 impressions for each minute that Twitter failed to act. Even by a refined measure, that's 47 million people that saw his tweets. And they weren't all anti-Semitic tweets, but a number of them were. Right? In this kind of sterile environment, communal organizations like the CST are being warned that Wiley's arrest would lead to rioting in some instances, to anger, frustration. They're all of a sudden in what was a kind of a friendly, comradely environment, there becomes distrust. And the content, again, was not illegal in this case. The potential harms are incalculable. The online harms, they percolate social media, they're vast, they impact everything from democracy to the individual who's scared at home, and at present they're unregulated. And that lack of regulation means it's hit and miss whether a platform's acting in good faith. There's a lack of consistency, illegal content is online, and there's no compulsion at the moment to have safety by design. For users, it means, turn off your phone can be the advice. It means that you have to individually report when you're being piled on with potentially thousands of hateful messages. High profile individuals, there's risks involved when they, as we saw in the Wiley case, can go on racist rants. And there's the potential for these rabbit holes of hate that people are funneled down by algorithms. So personally, I'd like to see legislation. Hugo, I hope I'll be able to propose something that you can get on board with. I'm pragmatic, I love social media, and I use it. I'm a big wrestling fan. I get to engage with wrestlers online. What isn't there to love? But we do need regulation. We need a regulator, a duty of care, codes of practice, education, an address for anonymity, and penalties that involve senior individual management liability. So I'm sure we'll get into all of that, but that's just some headlines of what I think some of the issues are. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Danny. Well, look, before I start quizzing people with questions, I think it'd be helpful if the various members of the panel could just briefly outline their thoughts and where they approach this from. I suppose if we could start with Lord Pickles.
It's not going to be easy for all the reasons that we've just heard. We've already seen a whole bunch of coalition people that see this as some form of censorship, and it's about free speech. It isn't really. It's not really about free speech. It's about keeping people safe. It's about ensuring that people are not made to feel uncomfortable or frightened walking on the street and doing their enormous business. I mean, in terms of experience, my experience is, in terms of this has really only been on anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. And I think we need to kind of understand why people are doing this. And an event that took place 75 years ago, 80 to 75 years ago, you think, well, why now? And then you remember that the last phase of any genocide is denial, and it is about belittling, trying to change things, trying to change people's perception, and undermining the whole thing from within. I apologize to the other member because they've heard me say this before. I visited the murder camp of Treblinka in Poland not so long ago, and most of it had been destroyed by the Nazis as the Red Army advanced. And there's quite a moving memorial there, and I was surrounded by a lot of Israeli school kids, and it was a feeling of uplift, of triumph over this really unpleasant place. I mean, Treblinka's nobody went to work in Treblinka. You just went there and you were murdered. Most people never lasted more than a couple of hours having arrived there. And as you do, I got out my phone and took a picture and said how moving it was to be here. Within minutes, I had somebody come back to me that said, nobody died at Treblinka. It was just a transit camp. Maybe there was the odd outbreak of flu, and yet we know close to 1 million people were killed there in just a few months. And we've seen, I think, in the whole process of coronavirus, the use of the internet to deliberately get people to hate one another. Could be Jewish people accused of spreading. It could be Chinese. It could be migrants, and all are targeted. And this is about trying to dissolve society from within. But I'm not surprised that the bill's been a little delayed, because it is going to be immensely difficult to form it in such a way as that we protect people's right to disagree without ensuring that people's right to hatred and to incitement of hatred is seriously curtailed.
Thank you very much, Lord Pickles. Baroness Morgan, if I could come to you next.
Hugo, thank you, and thank you for the organisers for this Fringe event this evening. It sounds so strange to a Fringe event. Fringe events to me normally involve a very overpacked hotel room with some warm white wine at the back of the room and trying to make your points whilst everyone's busy planning their nights out. This is an important topic, and actually I think the question of the title, how to legislate, you're right, Hugo, to start it off with the kind of, do we want to legislate? I mean, in my view, the answer is yes, but exactly as Eric has just said, the reason that the white papers and the interim response, and now we're waiting for the legislation, are taking time is because it is complicated, and we do believe in free speech and a free press in this country, and we do believe up to a point in the right to offend others, but there does come a point where actually the societal impacts of what is allowed to spread unchecked are just so massive and so detrimental. And social media, in particular Twitter, but I think there are obviously many other platforms as well, has become basically part of the public space, the public square of debate. And the answer is definitely not to say, well, if you don't like it, then leave. We wouldn't say that to people, whether we're talking about the House of Commons or about the media or about walking around the streets. The answer to violence against women and girls is not to blame the victim and say you need to get out of that space. And so I don't see why that's acceptable potentially for online platforms as well. We are right to be cautious. But there's no doubt that, as Shoshana Zuboff says, big tech has morphed into both publishing platforms, it's morphed into broadcasting, as well as harvesting a lot of data. And actually the data aspect is quite different from the online harms, legal content, legal but harmful, and illegal content. But I would just say, from a former DCMS perspective and from a former government perspective, they are different, but they are, of course, all intertwined. And government is also right to want to be a receptive environment for tech companies to be based here in the UK with an overall supportive regulatory environment. And that's why, if I were the tech platforms, actually, I would want the UK to get on with this legislation, because I think that the UK will have that debate in Parliament elsewhere about that balance between free speech, but also cracking down on very harmful content online. And I think that we will find a way through. And I would just say this is a starting point. any bill that we get. It's going to have to develop in the same way as environmental protection legislation develops, or health and safety legislation. Not always popular, not always widely supported, but that's what will happen with the legislation. I think the point that Danny made is really important about what happens online and then the offline impacts. I had to be careful in this debate as a woman in public life. And when I became DCMS secretary, this is an area that's very important to me. It is important both as a member of parliament, because I see harmful content when people are able to buy books about how to potentially cause themselves harm and even death, as a constituent did, then I'm worried on that basis. But I'm equally worried when I check my Twitter feed one Saturday morning as I'm about to go out campaigning and find that I have got on there, a death threat where somebody wished that I could be Joe Coxed. Turned out there was Russian interference and involvement in that particular tweet. But when I reported it to Twitter, they said, the algorithm said, I don't see why this is at all threatening or anything else. What the algorithm, of course, missed was the reference to Joe Cox and what that actually meant. In the end, we got a human person involved at Twitter who did see what the problem was, and the accounts, everything else, were taken action. Final thing I'll just say is, what we're saying in this, it's not about the platforms or the regulator dealing with thousands of individual complaints. It's about the platforms owing a duty of care to their users, and it's drafted that very specific way. And the thing that will really concentrate minds, and I very much hope we'll see in the legislation, or I think there will be amendments to it, is that senior management, as in financial services industry and others, have to have personal liability. That will really focus minds, and we'll end up with platforms that absolutely do enhance free speech and open debate, but don't allow harmful misinformation and other content to proliferate completely unchecked.
Thank you very much, Lady Morgan. Karen Pollock.
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you from me for chairing this and doing this for us. And thank you to all the panelists as well for joining us with the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust. I'm afraid, Hugo, it might be a less lively discussion than you would like, because I think we all agree with each other broadly. The way I look at it is this. I think there's a personal issue, which is I use social media. I regard it as a force for good. I enjoy a lot of banter and conversation and in finding out things, and it's fun. But it does have this dark area where it can be personal, either to me or anti-Semitic, hateful, etc. And the question is, what are the consequences when these incidents or issues arise? And it seems to me that the consequences are only really enforced, or we only really see consequences when either, for example, the case that Danny cited, like Wiley, which was incessant for 48 hours and very public, or when you've got a whole full force of an organization behind you constantly reporting the tweets or whatever else. I mean, Danny referred to this earlier, but the fact is you have to personally report every single piece of abuse you receive. It is time consuming. It is baffling when it's not recognized as hate. And in the end, you sort of give up on the process, which is quite, well, it's deflating, isn't it? And in a sense, if social media, if online activity is supposed to represent part of society and how we interact, then I think that's a problem. I think the other thing, though, the other angle that I come to this really with is understanding, certainly in my line of work, we're working with a lot of young people. You're going to hear from Rosie herself, so I'm not going to explicitly talk about Rosie's experience, but the fact is that young people in particular use, they are online to find out facts. They're also, though, online, saying what they're doing. And often they will be saying they're doing something to support Holocaust education. They're not Jewish, yet they somehow find themselves in the line of fire, getting a whole blast of anti-Semitism. And how you manage that is really tricky. We can give advice in terms of tools as to how to, be strong or to ignore, as Danny said, or whatever else. But actually, I think there's a responsibility, like in any other forum, that when you cross a line, there has to be some sort of consequence. So all I would say is, without repeating things that have already been said, is that I feel personally that there are certain times, and there have been many occasions, where if companies knew that there were substantial consequences for them, either financially, either personal liability, as Nikki referred to, but also knowing that the processes are really being scrutinized, I think it would actually enable, it would not stop freedom of speech or expression. It would actually just enable people to interact freely without fear of somehow becoming a victim simply for posting something that, you know, should be regarded as innocuous. That's all I'm going to contribute now, and I'll wait for the questions.
Thank you very much, Karen. Rosie Mulhern, let's hear from you.
Thank you. My name is Rosie, and I'm a 19-year-old university student, speaking to you today as a regional ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust, and as a young person who has heard the testimony of Holocaust survivors, and so refuses to remain silent when I see racism thrive online. The first time I saw anti-Semitic content online, I was 15 years old. I was studying Nazi Germany as part of my history GCSE and took to the internet to learn more. But instead, I was confronted with several videos on YouTube posing as factual documentaries, but in fact expressed support for Hitler, denied the Holocaust, and propagated anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. This was content that I had accidentally encountered as a teenager and accessed within seconds of a Google search. 4 years later, I'm sorry to say I am now often exposed to anti-Semitism online, including Facebook posts blaming Jews for coronavirus, tweets sending death threats to Jewish activists, Instagram posts claiming that the Holocaust was a myth to justify Israel, and TikTok videos promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Young people are increasingly looking towards social media platforms as reliable sources of information to educate them and empower them with the truth. But if they ever interact with any form of hateful content online, then social media algorithms will push them into echo chambers of racism. For example, a recent TikTok video referencing Auschwitz showers gained over 6.5 million views because of the algorithm's ability to promote dangerous content to millions of young people. We know that the terrorist attacks against synagogues and mosques across the world in recent years were a direct result of their organized efforts online. Social media sites have actively protected racists in their online communities, racists who have organized terrorist attacks and murder. The far right have gone so far as to adapt their terminology to deliberately target their content towards young people, under the radar of existing weak online regulations, by using numbers like 88 and terms such as dancing Israelis, which references the conspiracy theory that Jews were responsible for 9/11. As of today, the TikTok hashtag Hitler Squad has 5.1 million views. It is horrifying and irresponsible that sites where the majority of content is aimed towards young people are still almost entirely unregulated. It should not be the responsibility of myself and other young people to constantly have to report hundreds of comments, posts, and videos for social media platforms to merely respond that the clearly racist content does not violate their guidelines. The efforts of organisations such as the Holocaust Educational Trust and events with esteemed speakers such as these give my generation hope that something will change. This online harms bill must ensure that social media platforms finally take responsibility and at long last stop defending racists and start protecting young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Well, look, it's my turn to ask a few questions, so I'll try not to be too fighty. Let me, if I could start with Lady Morgan, if I could ask you, what kind of response does government and feedback and relationship really does government have and get from the social media companies? Because they're the missing aspect in what we're talking about at the moment. When in government, have you found them cooperative or have you found them obstructive?
I would say cooperative, partly because I think they know that some form of regulation is coming. But as I say, what they're looking for, like many other businesses is a joined up approach from government to their businesses. As I say, the conversations I had with them often were about, could they get sufficient people to work in their businesses, right skills? Could they find places to locate? They would of course contribute to the or point to the contribution they make to the economy. And obviously the pushback from us would be, we understand all of that, and we want to encourage tech startups, we want to encourage successful big tech companies, but there will be some regulation, or at least that's what I would say, and I'm sure that's still the message. If nothing else, and as I say, data and what we've been talking about are quite different in many ways, but one of the things they are asking about is, what is the data protection legislation going to look like in this country after we have finally completely finish the transition period with the EU. And so they understand, they're beefing up, I think, their public affairs teams to deal with the online harms bill when it's going through Parliament. And I welcome that, because I think actually having that dialogue and that acceptance is really, really important. But I hope that the government and ministers are able to show real determination in saying, we are going to bring this forward, but inevitably things have got a bit busy this year with everything else that's going on.
Sure, thank you.
Hugo,
okay. Yes.
Hugo, can I add to that? I think
Please.
that, Danny, you would probably agree as well, that I think that, I hope, that we also, I think, would say that we're having far more engagement with social media companies than ever before, and welcome that. And that the more detailed attention of understanding, for example, conspiracy theories or different forms of anti-Semitism or keywords. I can't remember, I'm afraid, which speaker said it, but when something isn't necessarily recognized, I'm sorry, it was you, Nikki, when you talked about Joe Cox, like, the algorithm didn't get it, but by having actual people understanding why it might be problematic. So I definitely think there is more engagement, and surely, I mean, that is something we certainly welcome.
Sure. I mean, Karen and Danny as well. Are there heroes and villains here? Are there some companies that are notably better than other companies? And if there are, please tell us.
Yeah, well, yes, in my view. And just to come back on that last question, I wanted to take the other side of it, which is, it is excellent that the companies are building up their preparedness for this legislation, but they are hiring people straight out of government and straight out of regulators. And I do think that, well, there's a question there, isn't there? Is that all right? Are we happy with Facebook hiring the Ofcom head of content, or Twitter having ex-officials? Maybe we are, but there's a question there at least. And the other is, we are having, as charities, as civil society, good engagement with the tech companies, but that often means that we are helping them to develop policies and then having to do it again and again and again and again. And it's to our cost and to their benefit. And there has to be some redressing of that balance. Now, ad credits are all very well, but perhaps there's something else there that needs to be considered. On the goodies and the baddies, I think that there are examples of pure evil sites, as I would put them. So I think BitChute, YouTube for Nazis, as I would call it, is an evil site. You go on BitChute and it is difficult to find content that isn't hateful or harmful, in my view. 4chan and 8chan, similarly, anti-Semitic posts a couple of years ago on 8chan were over 1 million. Misogynistic posts were up to 800,000. I mean, these are sites that are full of horrible content that don't have frameworks in place to address that content, or openly say, we are free speech platforms, we don't want to address this content, anything goes. And then, of course, there are the bigger platforms which then attract more advertising, a cynic might say, and therefore are more responsible, or because they have people there that are great, that want to do good things too, or that have learned over time, either from us or others. And so, yes, the Facebooks and the Twitters and even the TikToks, it's a newer platform, we have positive engagement. So there are some good actors and some less good actors in that space. That's my opinion.
Sure.
I think things have improved. Going back 10 years ago, I was with David Cameron when he was trying to persuade Facebook to take down the showing of the decapitation of an aid worker, and you have no idea how hard it was to get Facebook at that time to take it down. Now, things, of course, enormously improved, and Facebook and Twitter are very ready and very able to engage with us. The other sites are, I think, increasingly important. But the one thing that really holds this process back is America and their amendment to their constitution with regard to free speech. So that's why quite a lot of organizations ensure that their domain is within the United States. And I would not be surprised as we move towards this, I suppose, depending on who is in the White House, to see a kind of clash when we start to regulate what are essentially American companies with regard to what they would see as an infringement of free speech. I think that advertising is the key. I think if you want to talk to these various social media companies, we can appeal to their sense of goodness and greatness, but if you grab them firmly by the wallet, I think we get their attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about them being fundamentally American companies that often have American priorities is a very apt one. When I was last year, or perhaps the year before, I went with the DCMS committee to Washington when they had their hearings, and the Americans there were very vocal about the fact that, look, these people don't care about you. You are not the market that matters. Lord Pickles, I wanted to ask you, look, it seems to me that a very important aspect of online harms, when we're talking about online harms, is national security. We've seen that in with election hacking or attempted election hacking in the United States. Perhaps it seems virtually certain, although unproven, also similar in this country. As a journalist, I find it quite hard to get readers to take that seriously. And it seems to me that one of the reasons I find it quite hard to get readers to take that seriously is because government doesn't take it terribly seriously either. What can we do to wake people up to the national security implications of a lawless, unregulated online space?
Well, sooner or later, the public will wake up to it. Sooner or later, I think it's part of the thing is that, we're all quite interested in Facebook and we're all quite interested in Twitter and the others, but most people aren't. I think it was pretty clear, maybe at the last election, that Twitter is not the United Kingdom, that people that contribute to it aren't particularly representative. But there's some pretty vile algorithms out there that can, you talked about sort of eating disorders, can target people, target vulnerable people towards a particular way of life, can target people towards towards suicide. And I think we have seen right across the world elections that have been affected, changed by what's happened. But it needs to go beyond that. People need to understand that people living, fellow citizens, are actually at risk because of the vile, deliberate way to undermine society from within. The kind of people that you're dealing with is beyond the kind of nutter that would sort of go out and spray paint some dreadful slogan. There are people there that are going about it in an intensely sophisticated way, with an intensely sophisticated message, using very sophisticated tools to get there. And it's part of government's job is to protect the population from that. And I think that's the method, rather than we need to explain. We don't need to explain to people about the risks in terms of general security. It's our job to ensure that people are looked after and protected. So I don't think we should wait for a great awakening of the British public. By the time the British public have woken up to this, it'll be too late.
Okay. Rosie Mulhern, you're, unlike, without wishing to cast aspersions on the rest of the panel, unlike the rest of us, you are a generational digital native, I would say, which means social media. Sorry, Karen, I was forgetting. Which means you have grown up with social media intertwined with your life. Getting away from hate speech I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how the impact of that, how important what's happening on TikTok, on Instagram, on wherever is to people of your age and your generation, and how and the extent to which it's always with you.
Social media really does take up my life and most people I know, really. I've had social media accounts since I was about 12 years old, and there definitely have been some negative effects for me. Outside of harms in terms of anti-Semitism, when I was younger than 16, I saw many posts encouraging suicide, encouraging eating disorders, self-harm, particularly as a teenage girl. I also was before, when I was maybe 14 years old, I was debating someone on feminism and they threatened to rape me when I was 14. Someone has threatened to track my IP address and find out where I live, and all of this is when I was underage. And all of this I also had no idea the significance of until now, looking back. I think as a teenager, as a young person, when you're involved in the community of social media, you do not realize how dangerous it can be until you have that retrospect and you can see how it's affected you in the long term.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to go to, we have some audience questions, which I shall go to in just a moment. But first, I wanted to ask Danny Stone, do you think, should we be banning only illegal content, or should we also be regulating offensive content? Because this goes right to the heart of the basically the free speech implications of this whole debate. Are we trying to clean up the way people talk, even if that includes impinging the sorts of speech that currently is legal?
Right, so there's two parts to that. One, so I wouldn't use the word ban, right? I think we are looking to try and put in place the right systems so people are not directed towards harm, okay? And so that the platforms can operate as effectively as they can. So that means that the idea is in the legislation, there'll be this duty of care on platforms. And at the moment, there is a risk that there will be two codes of practice under that duty of care underpinning it, where there should be lots of codes of practice. And specifically, there should be one, in my view, on harms. And what would that do? It would ensure that when you go onto Facebook, Twitter, any social media platform under the scope of the regulation, the search bar wouldn't prompt you towards hateful materials. The algorithms wouldn't prompt you towards harmful materials. There would be a single point of contact for police. There would be appropriate terms and conditions. There would be a proper reporting system, a way for the platform to feed back to you, and so on and so on and so on. So that's what I want to see addressed, is that harmful content. Now, how do we define harms? Well, at the moment, social media companies define harms for us. Government defines our harms in all other areas of life in respect of the TV that we watch, for example. You know, in fact, I think Ofcom, I'm not sure harms is even defined in the legislation, it's just harms, right? At the moment, social media companies define the harms. And to me, that's not acceptable, because social media platforms have been shown not to be good faith actors all the time. The free speech argument, I feel, is also actually, it doesn't really play, because we don't have free speech on these platforms. You cannot post some things which are entirely legal, which the platforms deem that they do not want on their turf, right? It's up to them. And equally, they dictate to a degree what you see. So you don't have the freedom to receive information either, because actually, often you will only see perhaps what they're curating towards you or what they direct you to see. So my view is that this legal but harmful content needs to be addressed, that we minimize it on the platforms. Look, I don't expect that it will all be taken off. I think people will still be able to put that content on there. It's just I don't want people to be directed towards it and then to go offline, as we've seen with incels, as we've seen with QAnon, as we've seen in the Finsbury Park Mosque, and then to cause the harm offline. So yes, I think there should be regulation for these harms, but the regulation I'm talking about is systems level. It's not trying to suddenly ban individual words, for example.
Understood. Yes, Karen.
An interesting, I don't know if Danny, you would agree that it's an example, but something that I often think when we talk about if it's illegal or if it's harmful is the difference of, obviously, laws in different countries. So, for example, Holocaust denial is illegal in Germany, but it isn't illegal here. Now, we would say Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism, and if being used to whip up hatred, it is incitement. But you have to join those dots. But that is often the rebuttal I will get from social media companies when I sort of say, you know, this is problematic, or well, it's not illegal. And I find it extraordinary, because I think there's something else that needs to be exercised when addressing that, but that is often the answer. The other point I wanted to make, slightly going back to something said earlier, whilst I absolutely accept that social media interaction is not wholly representative of society, we got a really good taste, for example, from Rosie, of some of the experiences I would say majority of young people have, which is shocking, actually, when you share it. And I think none of us really appreciate it, because none of us were doing that when we were 12, 13, 14. It just wasn't an experience we had. But there was a story that came out yesterday, but I think it had been reported earlier, but I think the case is being considered at the moment. There's a 17-year-old boy from Rugby who got onto some sort of echo chamber of far-right activists, had to prove his sort of, you know, hate of Jews. And then, even though there wasn't a specific instruction to him to go and harm Jews, he posted something like, "I'm working on the propaganda and the weapons, I need the men." So, i.e., he'd reached that conclusion where an impact there could have been a physical impact, but there was an intervention. And I think that's sort of the point, isn't it? That there are sometimes these groups where that's happening and it's attracting. I'm not suggesting he's innocent, but he's becoming part of a group where that's all he's hearing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, he's being groomed, and in other places we step in for other types of grooming and saying that's not, and that's exactly what's happening there. I think what this highlights is, you know, it's not easy, but the question is, do we think it's acceptable to do nothing? And I can't think that most of us would think that anymore, and I certainly don't think the government thinks that.
Sure. Okay. Well, we have some audience questions. Do send in more. Assuming you are still there. I can see you're still there, so do send in more. The first question, this is from Adam Kinsley, and I suppose it's for Baroness Morgan. He says, "I welcome Baroness Morgan's comments about senior management responsibilities. Next week marks the 3-year anniversary of the DCMS Green Paper, and it's 8 months since the interim response. Recognizing it's the starting point, isn't it crucial that we get the basic framework up and running, especially given it's likely to take at least the whole of next year to go through Parliament?" I guess, you know, another way of saying that is, what's taking so long?
Well, look, I agree with the questioner. I'd like to get on with it, but I think we have to be realistic that government bandwidth has been severely constrained by dealing with coronavirus, and of course online harms and many other things have so far not been able to have the airtime or get to the top of the priority list in the way that many people would hope. Having said that, I mean, I think that ministers now are, of course, focusing on the virus, but they are also trying, I think officials are trying very much to look at what the other things that need progressing. And we've talked about misinformation around the virus, but also around potential vaccine. You know, all of that is relevant to the current crisis. So I suspect that the noise in Westminster about the bill and the need for publication of the next stage is going to grow in the next few months. And I know that ministers and officials will be very, very aware of that.
Sure. Okay, we also have a question from an anonymous attendee, which one may argue that an anonymous attendee is sort of an online harm in itself, but we'll let it go for now. I think I'll ask this to Lord Pickles. It says, you've mentioned so-called public social media like Facebook and Twitter. How about message systems like WhatsApp? How to regulate hate speech there? Now that's a very big question. It strikes me, Lord Pickles, because when we're talking about WhatsApp, we're talking. But when we talk about regulating WhatsApp, we're talking first about the possibility of policing WhatsApp, which is a very, there very much is a civil liberties question there about the extent to which the state first should and secondly can monitor private messaging systems like that. What do you feel we should be doing?
Well, WhatsApp's picked out because it's the most obvious of the encrypting services, and I mean, it leads on from what we've just had. Actually, I'll tell you what my basic worry about the online harm bill is. I'm kind of worrying that there is a a movement, a feeling in politics right now about concerns about state supervision, state regulation. We've had a whole load of stuff with regard to personal liberties, pubs being closed down at 10 o'clock. And I think it's actually creating the perfect storm for this bill when it hits the Commons and hits the Lords. So I think on things like you've just been talking, we need to be absolutely really clear and be speaking with a clear and unambiguous voice. Because if I was a party manager, which at one time in my life I was, and so was Nikki, I'd be quite worried about this bill just clogging up the whole parliamentary system. I think in a way, we should, for now, ignore WhatsApp and encrypting services and deal with things that are available in the way that the Times is available, in the way that radio is available, in the way that other forms of media are available. And I don't think dealing with an encrypted service with people talking among themselves should get in the way of dealing with this greater harm. But I think there's a kind of an assumption is that the government should have done this. We should be producing this, and I think it's going to be far from a clear process. And let me be clear: I want to see an online harms bill. I'm worried desperately about timing and about us opening up a difficult debate coming straight after the state trying to regulate part of people's lives.
I mean, Danny Stone, to pass that one over to you, it looks like basically what we're talking about is two different kinds of social media, and that you have, as Lord Pickles says, the very public-facing social media where one might say terrible things happen and people aren't necessarily always aware that they're doing terrible things on them. But then you do have these encrypted platforms, with of course WhatsApp being the main one, but also Telegram and Signal. But I think WhatsApp has a particular effect. WhatsApp has been used in other countries to facilitate really, really nasty sectarian fake news, to some extent facilitate attempts at genocide in the Indian subcontinent. Does all of this mean anything if we leave them alone?
So my take is actually, I would refer you back to what I said before about what we can do about it, because it's an oven-ready solution, if you will. You have the duty of care and you have the code of practice. They apply to a Facebook or a Twitter as much as they apply to a Telegram or a WhatsApp. So in terms of reasonably foreseeable harms under a duty of care, WhatsApp should know that speed of transmission is an issue. Right, so if fake news is being transferred at a fast rate, and they did this during the COVID pandemic, when there was fake news being spread, right, they altered the way in which that news was able to be transferred to groups through WhatsApp. Right, they took action. So it is possible for WhatsApp to design its systems to address some of the harms that occur. Right, so it can do that as part of its duty of care. It can know that there is going to be an issue with, I don't know, it might be facial manipulation software and how it will address that in the future. That doesn't mean those individual messages that are encrypted are being dealt with. I don't think it's actually a civil liberties issue per se, right? It's more the systems level. What is it doing at systems level to protect people? And there will be supposedly super complaints, which are where issues can be floated up by representative groups, and there will be debate over who those are, to take issues to the regulator, which it will then address with the platform. So if something emerges with a WhatsApp or a Telegram, then the regulator will be able to be flexible enough to deal with those in due course. So not everything has to be done now. But my view is the duty of care still captures the WhatsApp, because we need to stop thinking about individual messages and to start thinking about systems level problems.
Sure. Rosie Mulhern, I'm sort of reluctant to treat you as the sole spokesman of your generation, but I'm going to anyway. When we talk about a civil liberties argument here, when we talk about, the state, the government looking over your shoulder at your messages, is that something you mind? Is that something you think people do mind? Or do people kind of just expect that there should be some kind of policing of what they themselves can do online?
I think it definitely will be a concern for a lot of people, the idea of freedom of speech being under attack by the government particularly, but I don't think that that is as much of an issue with this bill, particularly as it calls for greater transparency, which means that if your comment or post is deleted, you can appeal and then be told why it was deleted, which actually provides more education than we have right now, because I see all the time people have posts and videos removed for no reason. So actually, I think this bill could improve freedom of speech because it's also enabling Jews and other minorities to be able to speak more freely without having to deal with consequences of people sending them abuse and death threats. So actually, this could be an opportunity to expand freedom of speech. But I definitely think that I'm not sure about WhatsApp and sort of messenger apps, because I think they pose less of a danger in a way because they just have less outreach than the primary apps such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. And like Danny was saying earlier, it's the systems in place that we need to focus on, like these algorithms that are promoting content. So on TikTok, for example, which I did some research into in August, if you even watch a full TikTok video that has any sort of hateful content on it, then you will have more videos show up on your For You page. And many other social media apps work in that way. And that is the danger of online harms, is that people will be radicalized by these echo chambers because social media sites are promoting it to them. Whereas you don't quite get that with WhatsApp and Messenger apps.
Sure, thank you. We also have, I guess, what we describe as a comment rather than a question, which I'm normally quite hostile to, but this one is excellent, so I'm going to read it out. It's from Jonathan K, and it says, "Hi, I'm Jewish but also disabled. There is much disability hate talk online too. Tackling disability hate using the same legislation may be a way of swaying the Americans, as they already have very tough very tough disability anti-discrimination legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is treated very seriously by US companies. I say, having worked with some, which is I just throw that in as it seems like an interesting comment and something to think about. I have one more question for Baroness Morgan. I wanted to ask, if we're talking about a regulator post legislation, who is the regulator? What do we think there? Do we think Ofcom? Do we think a new regulator? Do we think whoever the regulator is going to have roles in other areas? If we have a regulator specifically for online areas, how do we keep that regulator out of, for example, newspaper websites? Yeah. Should we keep it out of newspaper websites? Are we talking about regulating the comments under an article on the Daily Mail? I guess I appreciate that's quite a big question, but it'd be interesting to know your thoughts around it.
Well, it is a big question, but I think all of these are big questions, and I will answer. I just wanted to say, we don't have to have the bill immediately. We can have the bill for pre-legislative scrutiny, which is almost as hard as saying disability anti-discrimination. So we can and start to have this big debate. So in relation to the regulator, in the interim response, and I do think that Ofcom is the right place to start. It's not the only place to start, but again, anybody involved in setting up a new regulator, having to recruit them, find the people, get the skills, that is just another way for this to take more years to happen. I could see eventually, and interestingly, both in the Lord Putnam Digital Democracy report published by the House Lords Committee in the last few months, but also the House Laws Communications Committee came up with a digital regulator as well. We might end up with a separate regulator at some point. But I think with all of this, as you've alluded to, and as Eric alluded to, Hugo, we have to be very wary of mission creep. And that's why I say this is a starting point, not the end point. I think there will often be calls for this to go further, to do more. Ofcom seems to be the right place because they are the broadcasting regulator at the moment. They've also taken over responsibility looking at the BBC. But I do think their broadcasting experience, plus their understanding of the overall digital landscape, will help in terms of getting this up and running. But it's a big ask for Ofcom, and they will obviously need to recruit or to get people to to gain new skills to be able to do this successfully. And I suspect that it will it will start, and then as Danny says, as they become more used to looking at the systems of the social media platforms, actually they will gain in confidence in terms of dealing with things like super complaints, for example.
Sure, thank you very much. I guess my final question, which I suppose I'll ask to Lord Pickles, if we have a regulator of this sort, and it is responsible for online harms which include fake news, for example, firstly, how do we stop it being referred to as a ministry of truth? Because it will be, if only by me, as often as I can. But how do we stop it being referred to as something like a ministry of truth, and being treated as a ministry of truth with all the connotations that has? And secondly, should it also regulate political adverts and political speech?
That's why Ofcom is actually the best regulator to start it off, because the real danger is in a way we saw mission creep with the Electoral Commission. You will find yourself being regulated. People will start to look at newspapers. That's less likely to happen if Ofcom are doing it. And you say, well, is it going to affect political? Well, it's already there. I mean, the President of the United States has been taken down for saying something that the ownership of Twitter or of Facebook didn't like.
But is that a good thing in your view or a bad thing?
I think it's a
thing,
neutral thing. It's a thing. And don't be upset about that. We can't define everything. This is going to evolve. There's going to be the regulator will make mistakes, but we have checks and balances to kind of ensure that our primary mission is to make people safe. And sure, we can find problems with WhatsApp, and sure we can find some over enthusiastic woke official who stops something down that is increasement of free speech. But that's how good policy is eventually devised.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, look, thank you to all of the panel. I think it's my job now to hand over to Karen Pollock to send us all home. So Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Hugo. You don't really need to hand over to me, but I appreciate it. Really, it's just my pleasure to thank everybody who joined us. It's really good of you on a Monday cold evening to sit at your computers and be part of this discussion. To thank Lord Pickles and Baroness Morgan. We really appreciate your experience, insight and expertise on this. Danny, as always, to do this jointly together and to work, our organisations working together on this important issue. To Rosie for your brilliant contributions, which I think not only sort of open our eyes, but also make us feel quite confident that there is another generation who are going to speak out about what is clearly a challenge and an issue for the next generation. And then just to thank you, Hugo, for chairing this so brilliantly, and hopefully we'll all meet again and perhaps there'll be some progress on this as well.
Thank you.
All right, good evening.
Thanks all very much. Good night.